Walter Briggs, a quiet veteran with a faded tattoo, faces mockery at the Fork and Skillet diner. Mocked for his worn appearance and asked to move outside due to complaints, he complies silently. But when Jeremy Ray, a Navy SEAL, recognizes Walter's tattoo, a mark of a legend from Operation Cinderpoint, everything shifts. Jeremy salutes him, stunning the diner into silence. The room, once filled with careless laughter, now grapples with shame. Walter's unspoken courage begins to unravel, sparking curiosity. Who is this man and what heroic past does he carry beneath his unassuming exterior? If Walter Briggs' story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Honor unsung heroes by sharing their stories in the comments. Thank you for joining us and spreading these meaningful tales. Let's keep their legacies alive together. The diner hummed with the clatter of plates and the low murmur of small-town talk. But a subtle shift rippled through the air as Walter Briggs stepped inside. At 84, his steps were slow, deliberate, each one marked by the soft tap of his cane against the linoleum floor. His brown coat, worn and slightly too large, hung loosely on his frail frame, swaying with his uneven gait. The morning sun poured through the windows of the Fork and Skillet, catching the faded tattoo on his left forearm, a dagger piercing an anchor, its edges blurred by decades of sun, salt, and time. To Walter, that tattoo wasn't just ink. It was a monument to a life he'd never fully left behind, a silent vow carved into his skin. He didn't notice the glances from the other patrons, or perhaps he did, but chose not to care. His sharp eyes, undimmed by age, were fixed on the booth in the back, the one by the window where the light spilled just right, warming the cracked vinyl seat. Walter eased himself into the booth with a quiet grunt, his trembling hands setting down his tray. 2 pieces of toast, a pair of eggs, and a steaming cup of black coffee. No sugar, no cream. It was the Veterans Day special, a $1 meal he ordered every year, not for the savings. He could have afforded more, but because it was a ritual. Each bite, each sip, was a quiet act of remembrance for someone who never made it home to share this meal. His gnarled fingers traced the rim of the mug as he stared out the window, watching the Kansas breeze stir the trees. In his mind, he was somewhere else, on a ship, in the dark, where the air smelled of salt and fear, where the weight of choices made in split seconds still lingered. The memories were heavy, but they were his, and he carried them with a quiet resolve. At a nearby table, a group of men in their 50s, dressed in polos and faded denim, laughed over their pancakes and bacon. One, a stocky man with a reddened face, nudged his friend and nodded toward Walter. "Check out the tattoo," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the diner, edged with a careless mockery. "Looks like he got it off a cereal box." The others chuckled, their laughter sharp and unthinking, the kind that spills out when people assume they know more than they do. "What's it supposed to be, anyway? Some pirate badge?" another added, smirking as he sliced into his food. "Bet he did it himself with a paperclip and a lighter in someone's garage." The table erupted again, their voices bouncing off the walls, oblivious to the weight of their words. To them, Walter was just an old man, a fixture in this sleepy Kansas town, someone who sat under the rusted sign of his old auto shop, Briggs & Sons, though the Sons had long since faded from both the sign and his life. Walter didn't flinch. He never did. His gaze remained fixed on the window. On the way, the light danced through the leaves, as if the world outside held answers the diner never could. Inside, though, his heart tightened, not with anger, but with a quiet ache he'd carried for decades. These men didn't know. They couldn't. They saw the trembling hands, the limp, the faded olive green shirt he'd worn since his Navy days, and they assumed that was all there was to him. But Walter had carried burdens heavier than their laughter, burdens that had etched lines into his face and his soul. He'd seen things they'd never understand, not because they couldn't, but because they'd never had to. He stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the mug, a steady rhythm that grounded him against the sting of their words. A young waitress, Kelsey, just 19, and still learning the rhythm of the diner, approached his table. Her apron was slightly crooked, her hands fidgeting with a pen as she spoke. "Sir," she said, her voice soft but uncertain, "would you mind moving to the outdoor seating? Someone, said your presence is making them uncomfortable." Her cheeks flushed as she spoke, her eyes darting away, unable to hold the weight of his gaze. For a moment, Walter looked at her, and in that brief exchange, she saw something. A depth, a story, a quiet strength that made her words feel hollow. There was no anger in his eyes, no accusation, just a stillness that made her question herself. Without a word, he nodded. He slid his tray across the table, steadied his cane, and rose with effort, his movements slow but deliberate. The diner carried on around him, forks clinking, conversations humming. But no one looked up. No one noticed the way his shoulders squared, the way he carried himself with a dignity that didn't need to shout. Behind him, a voice muttered, low but clear enough to sting. If he was really military, he'd have medals or something, not just some cheap tattoo. The words hung in the air, unnoticed by most, but they landed like a stone in Walter's chest. Still, he didn't turn back. He pushed open the door, the faint chime marking his exit, and stepped into the cool morning air. For a moment he stood there, the breeze brushing against his face, and he felt the weight of it all. The years, the losses, the quiet he'd chosen over pride. He wasn't here for their approval. He was here for the memory of a friend, a promise kept through eggs and toast and a cup of black coffee. Inside, the diner hummed along, oblivious to the man they'd dismissed. Kelsey returned to the counter, her hands still shaking slightly, replaying that moment in her mind. She hadn't meant to hurt him. She was just doing her job, following orders from a customer who'd complained, but the look in his eyes stayed with her, a quiet question she couldn't answer. The men at the table continued their breakfast, their laughter fading into the background noise of the diner. They didn't know it yet, but the room was about to change. The door chimed again, and a young man stepped inside, a Navy SEAL, his presence commanding without effort. The diner fell silent, as if the air itself had paused. Coffee cups hovered midair, forks stilled, mouths half open. He scanned the room, his eyes sharp and searching, until they landed on the empty booth by the window. Then, with a precision that spoke of discipline and purpose, he raised his hand in a perfect salute, his gaze fixed on the door Walter had just passed through. The gesture was unmistakable, a tribute that carried a weight the room couldn't ignore. Whispers rippled through the diner, forks clattered back to plates, and eyes darted toward the door, toward the old man they'd laughed at moments before. Who was he, and why had a war hero just called him Sir? Walter Briggs had lived in this Kansas town for over 40 years, a quiet figure who blended into the background of Main and Fowler streets. Every morning he rose early, polished his boots, and pressed the same olive green shirt he'd worn since his Navy days, a shirt older than most of the people in the diner. It wasn't about fashion or stubbornness. It was about loyalty, about holding on to something that still mattered when so much else had slipped away. His auto shop, Briggs & Sons, had been a cornerstone of the town once, but time had worn it down, just as it had worn down Walter. Yet he carried on, limping to the diner each Veterans Day, not for the food, but for the memory of someone who deserved to be remembered. And though the men in the diner didn't know it, though they'd mocked the tattoo and questioned his past, Walter's silence wasn't weakness. It was the strength of a man who'd fought battles they'd never comprehend, who'd earned that salute in ways they'd never understand. The diner buzzed with the kind of energy only a small town Saturday morning could muster. Families filled the booths, their laughter mingling with the clink of silverware, while retirees swapped stories over steaming mugs of coffee. Locals, their faces etched with familiarity, exchanged nods across tables as if they'd shared secrets since grade school. The air smelled of pancakes, bacon, and the faint tang of nostalgia that clung to places like this, where time seemed to slow just enough to let memories breathe. Kelsey, barely a month into her job as a server, navigated the chaos with a coffee pot in hand, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the linoleum floor. She'd just topped off the last of the regulars' cups when Ray, the manager, sidled up to her. His forehead gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his starched collar so stiff it seemed to choke him. Ray wasn't cruel, but he had a way of making every word feel like an order, his thin lips barely moving as he leaned in close. "Kelsey, I need you to ask the gentleman at table 9 to move outside," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. She blinked, caught off guard, her fingers tightening around the coffee pot's handle. Outside? She asked, her brow furrowing. Ray's eyes flicked toward the corner booth by the window, where Walter sat alone, his tray untouched save for a half-empty cup of black coffee. Yeah, Ray continued, shifting uncomfortably. Some folks are unsettled. Said he smells like motor oil, makes the place feel like a homeless shelter. His words landed like a punch, and Kelsey's stomach twisted. Walter hadn't done anything wrong. She'd seen him there before. Always quiet, always polite. His weathered hands folded neatly around his mug. He hasn't caused any trouble, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, hoping Ray might reconsider. But he was already turning back toward the kitchen, his tone clipped. Just do it, Kelsey. Keep it polite. We've got paying customers to think about. And with that, he was gone, leaving her standing there, the coffee pot suddenly feeling heavier, like it was anchoring her to the spot. Every fiber of her being screamed that this was wrong. Walter wasn't just some stranger. He was a fixture here, as much a part of the diner as the cracked vinyl booths or the jukebox that hadn't worked since she was a kid. But this was her first real job, the kind that paid for gas and kept her from leaning on her parents. Losing it wasn't an option. So with a deep breath that did little to steady her nerves, she forced her feet to move toward Walter's booth. The morning light streamed through the window, painting his corner in soft golds and casting long shadows across his tray. His hands, rough and lined with years of hard work, rested on the table, still except for the faintest tremor. She noticed the faded tattoo on his forearm, an anchor entwined with a dagger, its edges blurred by time. It wasn't like the flashy tattoos her brother had gotten at some mall parlor last summer, all bright ink and bravado. This one felt different, heavier, like it carried stories too big for words. Earned, she thought, though she didn't know why. Sir, she started, her voice so soft it barely reached him. He didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the coffee cup as if it held answers he'd been searching for. She cleared her throat, trying again. I'm really sorry, but my manager asked if you could move to the patio. There have been some complaints. The words felt like betrayal as they left her lips, each one stinging her throat. She wanted to take them back, to tell him she didn't mean it, that it wasn't her idea. But she stood there, frozen, waiting. Walter lifted his eyes, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. His gaze was piercing, yet gentle. The blue of his irises faded but startlingly clear, like a sky after a storm. There was no anger there, no resentment, just a deep, bone-weary tiredness that made her chest ache. Behind that exhaustion, though, she glimpsed something else. A quiet strength, a resilience that spoke of battles fought and survived, even if no one else saw the scars. He held her gaze longer than she expected, and in that silence, she felt the weight of his life pressing against her own. No trouble, he said finally, his voice low and rough, like gravel smoothed by years of wear. He reached for his tray, sliding it toward himself with deliberate care, then gripped the cane leaning against the booth. As he moved, Kelsey heard a faint chuckle from the booth behind her. Oh, guess the wannabe's been relocated, a man said, his voice dripping with mockery. Another took a loud slurp of his soda, followed by lazy laughter, the kind that echoed through school hallways when kids thought no one was watching. The sound made her skin prickle with shame, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. Walter rose slowly, his movements measured but steady. As he turned, the rubber foot of his prosthetic leg caught against the table's base, sending a faint clank through the air. He paused, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, then reset his stance with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Each step he took was deliberate, his limp more pronounced now, but he didn't falter. The glass door chimed dully as he pushed it open and stepped outside, the sound fading as it closed behind him. The patio was empty, its table stark under a Kansas sky too bright, too clear for the heaviness that hung in the air. Kelsey stood rooted to the spot, her knuckles white around the coffee pot. She wanted to follow him, to say something, anything, to undo what had just happened. But the diner's rhythm swallowed the moment. Forks scraped against plates, conversations resumed, and laughter bubbled up again, as if nothing had changed. No one looked at the window where Walter now sat, his tray trembling slightly in his hands, the sunlight catching the lines of his face. To them, he was just the quiet old man at the diner, a ghost passing through their morning routine. But Walter Briggs was more than that. Long before he was the man in the corner booth, he'd carried another name, Ghost Line Bravo. It wasn't a name you'd find in history books or etched on a monument. It came with no medals, no parades, no speeches to mark its weight. In the Vietnam War, Walter had been part of a logistics support team embedded with SEAL units, the unseen hands that made impossible missions possible. His job was to set up forward supply caches and evacuation routes, ensuring that soldiers deep in enemy territory had what they needed to survive. There were no headlines for men like him, no glory in the shadows. But without Walter and his team, those missions would have been stranded, their men left to the mercy of the jungle. It was 1971, and the war had spiraled into its most brutal, chaotic years. Walter, then 30, found himself deployed in the Annamite Mountains, a rugged stretch of earth where danger lurked in every shadow. His unit's mission was clear but daunting. Support Operation Lantern Trail, a classified effort to rescue American prisoners of war rumored to be held in a remote jungle compound near the Laos border. The operation was a black file, its detail buried deep, known only to those who needed to know. Walter's role was to ensure the team had the supplies and escape routes to pull it off, a task that demanded precision under pressure, where a single mistake could cost lives. As he sat on the patio now, the Kansas sunlight glinting off his tray, those memories felt both distant and achingly close. The weight of that time clung to him, in the lines of his face, the tremor in his hands, the prosthetic leg that marked the cost of his service. He didn't speak of it, not to the diner's patrons, not to anyone. But the tattoo on his arm, the anchor and dagger, whispered of a life lived in the margins of history, where courage didn't always come with recognition, and survival was its own kind of victory. He wasn't the type to storm buildings or charge into the fray. His role was quieter, more intricate, but no less vital to the mission's success. Walter's mind was a steel trap, cataloging every detail of the terrain with meticulous precision. He sketched enemy patrol routes by hand, his fingers steady as they traced paths through dense jungle. He calculated drop zones where supplies could land without a whisper, and he devised emergency signals, flashing coded messages with a flashlight's beam. His photographic memory was a gift, paired with a mechanical knack that could coax a broken radio back to life with nothing but a gum wrapper and a scavenged wire. Walter was the kind of man who thrived in the shadows of the operation, unnoticed but indispensable. That mission, though, would be his last. 6 days into the operation, their unit was trekking toward a secondary staging point, the jungle pressing in around them with its suffocating heat and endless hum of unseen life. Walter's closest friend, Daryl Monroe, led the way as pointman, his steps sure and deliberate, navigating the path Walter had marked. They trusted each other implicitly, their bond forged through countless hours of silence and shared glances that spoke louder than words. But in a single shattering moment, everything changed. Daryl's foot drifted just left of the trail, a misstep so slight it seemed impossible it could matter. The explosion tore through the air without warning, a deafening roar that obliterated the jungle's drone. One moment, Daryl was there, a familiar silhouette against the green. The next, he was gone, swallowed by fire and chaos. The blast hurled Walter backward, his body tumbling through the undergrowth, the world spinning in a kaleidoscope of heat, blood, and ringing ears. He landed nearly 20 feet away, the jungle canopy above him a dizzying blur of leaves and smoke. Pain seared through his senses, sharp and unrelenting, anchoring him to the moment. His right calf was gone, the realization hitting him like a second explosion, raw and disorienting. But the screams, those piercing, desperate cries from his squad snapped him back. They were scattered, disoriented, their formation shattered. 2 men were wounded, their groans mingling with the jungle's haze. The radio operator sat frozen, his calm fractured, hands trembling over the useless equipment. The unconscious soldier lay still, too still, and the map, their lifeline through this hell, was lost in the blast. Walter's mind, though, held fast. Propped against a splintered tree, blood soaking the earth beneath him, he tightened a tourniquet around his thigh with shaking hands. The pain was a white-hot scream in his nerves, but he pushed it down, his focus razor sharp. The map might be gone, but every line, every contour lived in his head. He barked orders, his voice steady despite the agony, directing the squad to form a defensive perimeter. His damage field radio crackled faintly, but he made it work, his fingers coaxing life from its battered circuits. With a signal mirror, he flashed coded blinks into the sky, relaying their coordinates with a precision born of desperation. Each flash was a plea, a prayer that someone was listening. Hours crawled by, each second stretching into eternity as the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Walter's strength waned, his vision blurring at the edges, but he refused to let go. He thought of Daryl, his grin, his quiet confidence, the way he'd always hum off key to break the tension. Walter dragged himself to his friend's body, refusing to let the jungle claim him. With every ounce of will, he hauled Daryl to the extraction point, his hands slick with blood and sweat, his heart heavy with a grief he couldn't yet name. When the evac choppers finally roared into view, their blades slicing through the humid air, relief washed over him. Not for himself, but for the men he'd gotten out. Every wounded soldier made it aboard. Every classified document was recovered. But Daryl didn't come back. Before that mission, Walter and Daryl had sealed a pact, not with words but with ink. In a dimly lit parlor in Saigon, they'd gotten matching tattoos, a dagger piercing an anchor, a design they'd laughed about, inspired by a cheap cereal box they'd mocked as kids. It wasn't regulation, wasn't Navy standard, it was theirs. As the artists wrapped their arms in bandages, Daryl's grin had been wide, his eyes bright with a promise neither needed to speak aloud. No matter what, they'd carry each other. Now Walter bore that tattoo alone, its lines etched into his skin like a vow he could never break. Walter returned stateside a changed man, his leg replaced by a prosthetic, his service acknowledged with a modest pension and a bus ticket home. There were no parades, no questions about what he'd endured. His work was too classified for fanfare. He settled in Kansas, opening a small garage where he fixed engines with the same precision he'd once applied to mission plans. He was quiet, reliable, the kind of man who mowed a neighbor's lawn when they were sick or taught local teenagers how to rebuild a carburetor. His hands steady despite the memories they carried. But every November 11th, Walter sought out a different diner, choosing a table by the window. He'd order something simple, coffee, eggs, maybe toast, and eat in silence. It wasn't about discounts or recognition. It was about honoring a promise, a meal shared with a friend who lived on in his memory. The tattoo, weathered by years of sun and scars, remained a quiet testament to that bond, a mark that didn't need to impress anyone, but was meant never to be forgotten. The bell above the door of the Fork and Skillet jingled softly as Lance Corporal Jeremy Ray stepped inside. He was dressed simply, jeans, a black t-shirt, his military bearing betrayed only by his high and tight haircut and the rigid posture he couldn't shake, even on leave. Home briefly to visit his parents in the next county, he'd stopped for coffee and eggs before meeting an old friend. The diner hummed with Sunday morning life. Frying pans hissed in the open kitchen, forks clinked against plates, and soft country music drifted through the air, just quiet enough to fade into the background. Jeremy scanned the room, half searching for a table, half savoring the rare calm of not being on high alert. His eyes caught on an old man sitting alone outside, his silhouette framed by the window, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the glass. There was something about him, something Jeremy couldn't quite place, but it stirred a quiet respect, a recognition of a story untold. Through the wide diner window, the world outside seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Jeremy Ray, mid-stride, felt his heart stutter, not at the sight of the man's weathered face, but at the mark etched into his skin, a tattoo faded like an old photograph, yet vivid in its significance. A dagger piercing an anchor, tilted slightly to the left, its lines uneven, raw, and authentic. This wasn't the work of a sterile parlor needle. It was a badge carved in the crucible of war, inked by calloused hands under the weight of survival. The sight of it rooted Jeremy to the spot, his breath catching as memories flooded back, unbidden, from a time that felt both distant and razor sharp. In his mind, he was back in Coronado, the final week of SEAL prep, the air thick with tension and the unspoken promise of what lay ahead. The instructors had passed around a stack of case files, each one a window into the lives of operators who existed only in shadow. Veterans whose names were never spoken, whose faces were never photographed, whose stories were woven into the fabric of the training like sacred texts. These were the ghosts of the SEALs, the ones who carried their burdens in silence, their sacrifices etched not in metals but in the marrow of their bones. One file had burned itself into Jeremy's memory, Ghostline Bravo, a logistics NCO who, during Operation Cinderpoint, had defied the odds. 6 men, trapped in the chaos of a mission gone sideways, owed their lives to this man's relentless will. A landmine had torn through their team, shredding their plans and their radio, leaving them stranded in hostile territory. The mission was a heartbeat away from being abandoned, with total loss expected. Yet this unnamed soldier, one leg mangled, had memorized extraction maps with a clarity that bordered on the supernatural. Through sheer grit, he'd signaled coordinates by hand, guiding rescue to their position. The only marker of his identity was a tattoo, shared by just 2 men, a dagger through an anchor, a symbol of defiance against the odds. Jeremy's feet moved before his mind could catch up, carrying him back outside, his boots crunching softly on the gravel lot. His heart pounded, a mix of awe and disbelief swirling in his chest. The wind tugged at the edges of a napkin tucked under the old man's plate, and Jeremy watched as the man, Walter, reached to pin it down, his hand revealing the tattoo more clearly. The sight stirred something deep within Jeremy, a reverence he hadn't known he carried. It wasn't just recognition. It was a collision of past and present, a moment where the stories that had shaped him suddenly took on flesh and bone. "Excuse me, sir," Jeremy said, his voice steady but laced with a tremor of uncertainty. Walter looked up, his eyes slow to focus, as if the weight of years pressed against them. His face was unreadable, a mask carved from experience, but there was a flicker of something. Surprise, perhaps, or wariness. Jeremy swallowed, his throat tight, and gestured toward the faded mark on Walter's hand. Were you part of Operation Cinderpoint?" The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Walter blinked, and for a moment, it was as if the name had unlocked a vault buried deep within him, one he'd sealed shut long ago. His lips parted, but no words came. His eyes, cloudy with age, locked onto Jeremy's, narrowing slightly as if measuring the younger man's intent. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded, just once, a gesture so small it might have been missed by anyone not looking for it. But to Jeremy, it was a thunderclap. His spine straightened, shoulders squared, feet snapping together as years of discipline surged to the surface. He wasn't in uniform today, but it didn't matter. In that moment, he wasn't just Jeremy Ray, a man stopping for coffee at a roadside diner. He was a SEAL, standing before a legend, one of the silent heroes he'd been taught to revere, the kind every operator dreamed of meeting just once in their lifetime. Without hesitation, Jeremy stepped onto the worn concrete patio just outside the diner's window. His posture was rigid, his movements precise, as he brought his right hand to his brow in a full military salute, crisp, deliberate, and heavy with respect. The world around him seemed to fade. Inside the diner, forks stilled, chairs creaked, and conversations dissolved into a hush. Customers turned, their eyes drawn to the scene unfolding beyond the glass. Walter Briggs sat frozen, his expression caught somewhere between shock and something softer, more fragile. His lips trembled as if words were forming but couldn't find their way out. His left hand, resting on the tray beside his plate, curled inward, fingers tightening as if grasping at a memory or a loss too heavy to name. Jeremy held the salute, his gaze unwavering. Then, in a voice loud enough to carry through the slightly cracked window, he spoke, each word deliberate, resonant with conviction. "This man," he said, turning slightly to address the diners inside, "is not just a veteran. He's part of our history, our training." Heads swiveled, eyes widening. A group of men at a nearby table, who had earlier tossed careless jabs at Walter's quiet demeanor, fell silent, their faces tightening with something like shame. Jeremy lowered his hand but stepped closer to the window, his voice steady, not loud but commanding in its quiet intensity. "In SEAL prep, We learn about legends, not the ones in movies, not the ones who chase glory, the real ones. The quiet operators who made the impossible possible and never spoke of it, men like him. His words landed like stones in still water, rippling through the diner. Walter's eyes glistened, and for a moment he seemed younger, as if the weight of years had lifted, revealing the man who had once carried 6 lives to safety on the strength of his will alone. Jeremy's chest ached with pride, with gratitude, with the weight of standing in the presence of someone who had shaped the very ethos he lived by. This wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a reckoning, a moment where the past reached out to touch the present, reminding him why he'd chosen this path, and why men like Walter, who carried their scars in silence, were the truest heroes of all. In the sweltering jungles of Vietnam, during the chaos of Operation Cinderpoint, a logistics officer faced a moment that would define his life. A landmine had ripped through his unit, obliterating half the team and destroying their only radio. The deafening explosion left 6 wounded men clinging to life, their groans mingling with the suffocating heat and the distant crack of gunfire. No evacuation was coming. No backup was possible. The officer, known later as Ghost Line Bravo, stood amid the wreckage, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. His mind raced, sifting through memories of train schedules he'd studied obsessively, knowing they were his only lifeline. With no equipment, he improvised, using flashes of light and a hastily devised code to signal a passing extraction crew. His hands trembled as he worked, but his focus never wavered. One by one, he guided the wounded to safety, their blood-soaked uniforms a stark reminder of the stakes. He didn't pause to consider the danger to himself or the weight of failure. He simply acted, driven by a quiet but unyielding sense of duty. When the last man was lifted away, he collapsed, exhausted but alive, his name destined to fade into the anonymity he'd earned. Decades later, in a small-town diner, that same man, now Walter, sat quietly at a corner booth. His coat bore grease stains from years of hard work, and his prosthetic leg creaked faintly with each careful step. The diner hummed with life, families laughing, plates clinking, the sizzle of the grill filling the air. But Walter's world was narrower, his thoughts drifting to a place where the jungle's heat still clung to his skin, where the faces of those 6 men, and one who never returned, lingered like ghosts. He didn't notice the curious glances from other patrons or the faint irritation of a waitress who saw only a disheveled old man lingering too long. Jeremy, a young Navy SEAL in a crisp uniform, sat nearby, his eyes catching on Walter's weathered frame and posture. He'd heard stories of valor growing up, tales of men who carried impossible burdens with quiet courage. One story in particular had stayed with him: a logistics officer in Vietnam, a man who'd saved lives with nothing but memory and grit. As Jeremy spoke, his voice low but carrying, the diner's noise softened. He recounted the story of Ghost Line Bravo, each word heavy with reverence. The patrons listened, their forks pausing midair, their laughter fading into a stillness that felt almost tangible. Jeremy's voice trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the weight of standing in the presence of a legend. He gestured gently toward Walter, his eyes shining with conviction. "That story ends here," he said, his words landing like a soft thunderclap in the room. The diner shifted. An elderly couple in their 70s rose from their booth, their movements slow but deliberate. The man's nod was solemn, his eyes glistening with memories of a war that had lived through, perhaps never fully shared. His wife gripped his hand, her lips pressed tight against the tide of emotion threatening to spill. A young mother at a nearby table dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, her thoughts flickering to her own children, wondering what burdens they might one day. The waitress, Kelsey, who'd earlier asked Walter to move along at management's behest, stood rooted to the spot. Her coffee pot shook in her grip, the liquid sloshing faintly as she stared at the man she'd so casually dismissed. Shame curled in her gut, sharp and unfamiliar, as she realized she'd nearly cast aside someone whose story deserved to be shouted from the rooftops. Walter felt the room's eyes on him, a weight heavier than any landmine's aftermath. His hand tightened on the edge of the table, not just to steady his body, but to anchor his heart against the flood of memories crashing over him. His chest ached with the faces of his men, those who'd saved, and the one he'd lost, Daryl Monroe, whose laughter had once cut through the jungle's dread like a beacon. He hadn't spoken yet, his voice locked behind years of silence, but his posture spoke of a man unaccustomed to being seen, let alone honored. Jeremy continued, his voice steady now, pointing to the tattoo on his arm, a dagger piercing an anchor. "This isn't for show," he said, his words carrying the quiet pride of someone who understood sacrifice. "It's worn by only two men. One didn't make it home. The other," he said, nodding toward Walter, "keeps showing up year after year to remember him in peace." The words cracked something in Walter's resolve. His eyes stung, and his throat tightened as he thought of Daryl, his friend, his brother, his in arms, whose absence had carved a wound no metal could heal. Finally, Walter spoke, his voice a thin rasp like wind over a barren field. "I didn't do anything special," he said, his words heavy with the humility of a man who'd never sought glory. Jeremy shook his head, his expression fierce with respect. "With all due respect, sir, you did what most men wouldn't. You kept going even after everyone stopped asking." The words landed like a balm on Walter's weathered soul, stirring emotions he'd buried under decades of routine and solitude. The elderly couple began to clap, their hands soft but steady, as if testing the moment's fragility. Others joined in, their applause hesitant at first, then swelling into something sacred. Not a loud cheer, but a solemn recognition of a man whose heroism had gone unspoken for too long. The men who'd mocked Walter earlier, their bravado now a distant, glanced away, their faces flushed with unease. One stood, his head bowed, and slipped it out the door, his departure a quiet admission of guilt. Jeremy looked down at Walter, his voice softening. "It's an honor to meet you, sir. The kind of honor that makes this uniform worth wearing." Walter didn't respond immediately, his eyes glistening with tears he hadn't shed in years. When he finally met Jeremy's gaze, he said simply, "Thank you, son. That's more than I ever expected." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a lifetime's unspoken gratitude. For a moment, the diner felt like a sacred space, as if the silence itself had spoken, reminding everyone of the dignity and sacrifice, the power of remembrance. The applause faded, leaving a reverent hush. Walter sat still, his hands folded in his lap, his untouched tray pushed aside. For once, no one noticed the stains on his coat or the faint creak of his prosthetic leg. The diner's patrons seemed to look inward, as if collectively remembering something they'd forgotten, about courage, about loss, about the men who carried both quietly. Kelsey approached, her footsteps hesitant, the coffee pot clutched like a lifeline. Her cheeks burned with shame, her earlier words, spoken at management's insistence, echoing in her mind like a betrayal. She couldn't meet Walter's eyes at first, her throat tight with regret. Would you like a fresh cup, sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Walter looked up, his gaze calm and kind, devoid of any resentment. She poured with trembling hands, the steam rising like an offering. "I didn't know," she said quickly, her words tumbling. "Out. I didn't see you." Walter's lips curved into a soft smile, one that spoke of a man used to being overlooked. "Most people don't," he said gently. Kelsey swallowed hard, then pressed on. "I wanted to say I'm sorry, and I think I know who you are." Walter's breath hitched, his eyes sharpening with curiosity. She glanced around, then leaned closer, her voice low. "My grandfather served in Vietnam. My mom never talked about him much. He died before I was born, but I remember his name, Daryl Monroe." The name struck Walter like a physical blow. His hand hovered above his coffee cup, trembling slightly, as if afraid to touch it and break the moment's fragile spell. "Daryl Monroe," he whispered, the name a prayer, a memory, a wound reopened. Kelsey nodded, her eyes wet, her voice unsteady. "They said he was one of the men you saved. Or tried to." Walter's heart stuttered, the diner's warmth fading as the jungle's heat pressed in again, Daryl's laughter echoing in his ears. He closed his eyes, grappling with the weight of that day, the one man he couldn't bring home. On a crisp Veterans Day morning, Walter Briggs sat quietly on the patio of the Fork and Skillet Diner, his weathered hands cradling a steaming cup of coffee. The air carried the faint chill of autumn, and his eyes, etched with years of unspoken stories, drifted to the horizon. He was a familiar sight here, always in the same worn coat, always with the slow, deliberate movements of a man carrying more than just the weight of age. His fingers, rough from years of labor and loss, reached into his coat pocket, brushing past crumpled receipts and faded napkins until they found the treasure he never left home without on this day. It was a photograph, its edges softened by time, the ink faded but defiant, holding fast to the memory it preserved. In it, two young men stood in jungle fatigues, arms slung over each other's shoulders, their smiles weak and unguarded. One was unmistakably Walter. Younger, leaner, his face unlined by the decades that followed. The other was Daryl Monroe, a name that still tightened Walter's chest after all these years. Across the patio, Kelsey, a young waitress with a quick smile and a habit of humming while she worked, approached with a coffee pot. She'd seen Walter countless times, just another regular, always polite but distant, his eyes carrying a quiet weight she couldn't quite place. Today, though, something shifted. As she refilled his cup, their conversation turned to Veterans Day, and Walter's voice, low and steady, mentioned a friend lost on a secret mission. "They never told us much," he said, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his coffee. "Just that he was brave, that he saved lives." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning Kelsey didn't yet grasp. When Walter handed her the photograph, his hand trembled, not from age but from the flood of memories it unleashed. She looked at the image, her breath catching. "That's him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's my grandpa." Kelsey's heart raced as she studied the photo, her grandfather's face staring back at her, frozen in a moment of joy she'd never witnessed. She'd grown up with stories of Daryl Monroe, a man lionized in family lore but distant, like a figure from a faded book. Now here was Walter, not just a customer, not just an old man, but a living bridge to her past. Her eyes flickered back to him, seeing him anew, his weathered face, the faint tattoo of a dagger through an anchor peeking from beneath his sleeve, the quiet strength in his posture. Walter's own heart stirred, a mix of pride and pain. "He saved my life," he said softly, the words carrying the weight of decades of gratitude and guilt. In that moment, the patio seemed to shrink, the world narrowing to just the two of them, bound by a shared loss they hadn't known they shared. Without thinking, Kelsey set the coffee pot down on the table, her hands trembling with emotion. She stepped forward and Walter, forgetting his cane for a moment, rose to meet her. Their embrace was simple, unadorned by grand gestures, but it carried the weight of two lives intertwined by fate. It was a hug that spoke of grief acknowledged, of stories reclaimed, of a connection forged in the quiet spaces where words fall short. Inside the diner, patrons watched through the window, some brushing tears from their cheeks, others nodding in silent understanding. Jeremy Ray, the diner's manager, stood nearby, his arms crossed, his face a mask of stoicism. But his eyes betrayed a deep respect, a recognition of something sacred unfolding before him. This wasn't a story of parades or medals. It was a story of two souls finding each other over coffee, of an old man and the granddaughter of his fallen comrade closing a circle left open for too long. By Monday, the moment had rippled outward, igniting the small town of Haven Ridge. Someone had captured a photograph just as Jeremy Ray saluted Walter, the morning sun illuminating the old man's face, his tattoo faint but unmistakable, the young manager standing tall in a gesture of unspoken reverence. The image was raw, unfiltered, and needed no explanation. It landed on the front page of the Haven Ridge Tribune under the headline, "A Salute to Silence," and from there it spread like wildfire. Local news picked it up, then state outlets, then online forums where military families shared their own stories of quiet heroism. By week's end, people were driving from neighboring counties to the Fork and Skillet, not for the food, but for the story, for Walter. Walter, though, remained unchanged. He still rose at 5 a.m., still laced up the same worn boots by his front door, still made his limping trek to the diner every Thursday. But now the back booth by the window was always his, not out of duty but out of reverence. Jeremy Ray, who had once asked Kelsey to move Walter outside to free up space, was the first to make it official. One quiet afternoon after the breakfast crowd had thinned, he approached Walter's table with a wooden plaque in hand. Crafted by a local artisan, It bore a simple engraving, a dagger through an anchor, carved into dark walnut, with a brass plate reading, "Reserved for Walter Briggs, steel beneath silence." The diner fell silent as Ray presented it, the weight of the gesture settling over the room like a solemn hymn. Walter didn't say much. He never did. He nodded, tapped the plaque once with his knuckle, and murmured, "Feels heavier than it looks." But his eyes, glistening with something unspoken, told a different story, a story of a man who had carried his burdens in silence and now found himself seen. He kept coming back, week after week, sitting in his booth, sipping his coffee. What changed wasn't Walter. It was the world around him. Veterans who had lived quietly in Haven Ridge, their stories tucked away like old medals in forgotten drawers, began to seek him out. They came to his booth, drawn by an invisible thread, bringing photographs, medals their children had never seen, letters they'd never mailed. Walter didn't offer grand speeches or sage advice. He listened, his presence a steady forge where broken pieces of memory could be mended, reshaped by the heat of shared understanding. He became more than a man. He became a beacon, a quiet permission for others to grieve, to remember, to stop hiding the limp that wasn't just physical, the flinch at fireworks, the dread of July heat that carried the ghost of jungle nights. Walter's booth became a sanctuary, a place where the unspoken could be said, where the weight of silence could be shared. And through it all, Kelsey watched, her heart swelling with pride for the grandfather she'd never known and the man who carried his memory. The Fork and Skillet wasn't just a diner anymore. It was a place where stories came full circle, where coffee and memory forged something stronger than the steel. The diner had transformed over time, evolving into more than just a place for coffee and eggs. It had become a sanctuary of stories, a living monument to those who carried their burdens quietly. At the heart of this change was Kelsey, now a beloved server whose warmth and attentiveness made her a favorite among regulars. She had poured her heart into creating a shadow box that hung above the plaque at Walter's booth, a small but sacred space. Inside, carefully preserved, was the original photograph Walter had carried for decades, a faded image of him and Daryl Monroe, their young faces etched with the weight of war. Beside it rested a neatly folded flag, a symbol of sacrifice, and a hand-lettered card that read, "For the ones who never told their stories." The words were simple, yet they carried a profound ache, a nod to the countless lives that had slipped through history's cracks. Kelsey felt a quiet pride every time she looked at it, her chest tightening with the thought of how many stories like Daryl's might never be told. She imagined Walter's rough hands placing the photo there, his fingers trembling, not from age but from the weight of memory. On the diner's wall, a chalkboard now displayed quotes from veterans who passed through Haven Ridge. Every Monday morning, Kelsey would stand before it, chalk in hand, carefully selecting a new quote to share. It was a ritual she cherished, a way to keep the voices of those who had served alive. One quote, Walter's favorite, lingered in her mind long after she wrote it. "Some of us never got medals. Some of us never wanted them, but we all needed to be remembered." The words felt like Walter himself, unassuming, yet heavy with truth. She'd catch him glancing at the chalkboard sometimes, his weathered face softening, a flicker of something like gratitude in his eyes. It wasn't just the words, it was the fact that someone had cared enough to write them down, to make sure they weren't forgotten. Walter's presence had rippled beyond the diner. Local high schools began inviting him to speak, drawn by the quiet legend he'd become. He always refused to talk about himself, deflecting questions about his own bravery with a shrug or a grunt. Instead, he'd pull out Daryl's photograph, holding it gently as he spoke of his friend's quiet courage, the kind that didn't demand attention but deserved it. He told stories of men who carried on through fear, who patched each other up in the chaos of war, who found ways to laugh even in the darkest moments. To the students, wide-eyed and restless, he explained that heroes didn't always wear polished shoes or crisp uniforms. Sometimes they were just men who showed up, day after day, doing what needed to be done. One student, bold enough to ask about the tattoo on Walter's arm, earned a rare smile. "As real as the men who wore it," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Kelsey, who sometimes attended these talks, felt her heart swell at his words. She could see the students lean forward, hanging on to every syllable, as if Walter was handing them a piece of history they could hold. Jeremy Ray's return to the diner was another moment that lingered in Kelsey's memory. He came back just before his next deployment, his face older now, marked by the weight of his own experiences. He and Walter didn't say much, just sat together in the booth by the window, sipping black coffee in a silence that spoke louder than words. Kelsey watched them from behind the counter, her hands busy wiping down plates, but her mind on the two men. She could feel the unspoken bond between them, a shared understanding forged in places she could only imagine. When Jeremy left, he slipped a single patch from his unit under Walter's napkin, a quiet gesture of respect. Walter didn't acknowledge it aloud, but Kelsey saw the way his fingers brushed over the patch before tucking it into his pocket, his eyes distant but warm. She wondered what it meant to him, what memories it stirred, but she never asked. Some things she knew were too sacred for questions. By the time winter settled over Haven Ridge, the town had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The diner had become a gathering place, a beacon for veterans, young and old. Walter, though, remained the same. He still sat alone in his booth, still paid for his coffee with exact change, still tipped Kelsey $1 more than the bill. He greeted every veteran who walked through the door with a nod, a small gesture that carried the weight of recognition. To him, it didn't matter if they'd served in jungles or deserts, in wars long past or still unfolding. They were part of the same unspoken brotherhood. Kelsey often caught herself watching him, marveling at how someone could carry so much history and yet live so quietly. The world had finally noticed Walter, and more importantly, it had begun to listen, not just to his stories, but to the truth he represented. That valor wasn't always loud, and sacrifice didn't always demand a spotlight. Walter Briggs never chased the recognition that came his way. The sudden attention, the newspaper articles, the framed clipping by the diner's door, the whispers of his name around town, made him smile sometimes, but it never changed him. He returned to his routine with the same steady rhythm. Thursday mornings at the diner, booth by the window, black coffee, 2 eggs over easy. He never ordered anything extravagant, as if simplicity was his way of staying grounded. Kelsey loved those quiet moments when the diner slowed down, and she could sit with him for a few minutes. He'd share stories about Daryl, how he'd hum old jazz tunes under his breath, how he'd fixed a Jeep in the pouring rain with nothing but a wrench and sheer stubbornness. Other times he'd talk about working on engines in the jungles, the air so thick with humidity it felt like breathing water. Kelsey could see the jungle in her mind, could almost feel the mud under her feet, the way Walter's voice brought it all to life. She'd laugh at his dry humor, but her heart ached for the weight he carried, the memories he didn't share. In the afternoons, Walter opened the garage behind his house, not as a business, but as a haven. He taught high school kids how to change their oil, his patience endless, even when their hands fumbled. He helped young fathers diagnose the rattles in their cars, crouching under hoods with a flashlight, his gruff voice guiding them through each step. When they tried to pay him, he'd wave them off with a grunt. "Just bring me a cup of coffee next time," he'd say, his eyes crinkling with a smile that hid more than it revealed. Kelsey knew he didn't need the money. What he needed was the connection, the chance to pass on something useful, to keep his hands and heart busy. She'd seen him run his fingers along the edge of his booth before sitting down, a ritual that seemed to anchor him. To her, it was as if he was touching the past, checking in with the memories that lived in that space, where purpose and loss met. 3 years later, on Veterans Day, Walter didn't show up for his Thursday coffee. Kelsey waited until noon, her stomach twisting with a worry she couldn't name. She walked the 2 blocks to his house, her breath catching in the cold November air. She found him in his armchair, facing the window, a book open in his lap, the photograph of Daryl tucked into his shirt pocket. He looked peaceful, as if he'd simply decided to rest after a long journey. The town mourned him like a father, a brother, a friend. Word spread quickly, and veterans from 5 counties arrived in Haven Ridge, some in dusty pickups, others in polished dress uniforms. The diner closed for the first time in a decade, its lights dimmed in reverence. A line formed outside the small white chapel before dawn, a quiet procession of locals, veterans, students, and families Walter had touched over the years. Some brought photos, small tokens of gratitude for a man who had given so much and asked for so little. Then came the sound of engines, a low rumble that turned heads. 6 black SUVs rolled into town from the East Road, and out stepped a team of active-duty Navy SEALs in full dress, their faces solemn. Leading them was Jeremy Ray, now a lieutenant, his eyes fixed ahead as he carried a folded flag with both hands. The sight of him brought a lump to Kelsey's throat. She hadn't known he was coming, but she wasn't surprised. The SEALs insisted on carrying Walter's casket themselves, their movements precise, their silence heavy with respect. No one dared stop them. The funeral was packed, the chapel overflowing with people whose lives Walter had quietly shaped. Kelsey stood in the back, her hands clasped tightly, tears streaming down her face as she listened to the stories shared. Stories of Walter's kindness, his quiet strength, his unwavering humility. She thought of the shadow box, the chalkboard, the booth by the window. She thought of Daryl, whose story Walter had kept alive. And she thought of Walter, who had never wanted a medal but had earned something far greater, a town that would never forget him. The cemetery was hushed, save for the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. A crowd had gathered more than anyone expected, their faces etched with a mix of grief, reverence, and something harder to name, perhaps awe. They had come to say goodbye to Walter Briggs, a man whose quiet life had rippled through their town and beyond in ways most had only begun to grasp. Some stood clutching mementos, a carburetor Walter had meticulously repaired, its metal gleaming faintly in their trembling hands, a tangible reminder of his knack for fixing what seemed beyond saving. Others held letters, creased and worn, penned by Walter after he'd spoken at their school assemblies, words that had lingered in their minds long after his soft voice faded. A few lingered at the back, hands pressed over their hearts, tears streaming down their faces without a sound. They couldn't pinpoint why they wept, only that the weight of Walter's absence felt personal, as if he'd carried a piece of them with him. As the sun pierced through the heavy clouds, casting golden rays over the graveside, Jeremy stepped forward. His boots crunched softly against the grass, his face tight with emotion he struggled to contain. In his hands, he held a small plaque, its polished steel catching the light. Carved into it was a symbol, a dagger piercing an anchor, a design that held a story few knew but all present felt the gravity of. Jeremy knelt beside Walter's headstone, his fingers tracing the plaque's edges before setting it gently into the earth. Beneath the symbol, 2 lines were etched. Walter Briggs, his silence saved lives. Simple words, yet they seemed to hum with a truth that settled deep into the hearts of everyone there. Jeremy lingered a moment, his head bowed, as if whispering a final promise to the man who had taught him what it meant to live with purpose. When the honor guard raised their rifles and fired their final salute, the sharp cracks echoed across the cemetery, then dissolved into a profound silence. No one moved. Not a single soul stirred for a full minute. The wind sighed through the trees, the leaves murmured, and in that stillness, it felt as though Walter was still among them. His presence lingered, gentle but unyielding, reminding them that true strength often dwells in the quietest corners of a person's soul. Walter had never sought the spotlight. He'd never craved medals or applause. His service had been woven into the fabric of his everyday life, silent, steadfast, and profound. Yet its echo would resonate for generations. Walter Briggs had never marched in parades or boasted of his deeds. His story wasn't shouted from podiums or splashed across headlines. Instead, it was told in fleeting moments. A faded tattoo on his forearm, its ink blurred by time but vivid in meaning. A quiet breakfast shared at a diner counter, where his steady gaze and rare smile spoke volumes, the way he carried himself with a dignity that needed no explanation. Through these small acts, he'd shown an entire town, and in time, a nation, what honor truly looked like. He wasn't chasing recognition. He didn't want to be hailed as a hero. All he'd ever wanted was to honor a friend, to keep a promise made long ago, to do what was right even when no one was watching. And in that, he'd done more than most. Walter's life was a testament to a kind of service too often overlooked. Around us, there are countless others like him, men and women whose names rarely make it into history books, whose stories remain untold, yet whose quiet courage shapes the world. The neighbor who laces up his worn boots each morning, ignoring the ache in his knees, because the work still needs doing. The woman who clocks in at the VA hospital, shift after shift, her hands steady despite the memories of a battlefield she never speaks of. The janitor who moves through the halls with a limp he doesn't explain, his silence a shield for a past he carries alone. These are the quiet veterans, the unsung helpers, the ones who bear invisible burdens with grace. They don't ask to be seen, but they deserve to be noticed. Walter's legacy wasn't just in the lives he touched directly, but in the challenge he left behind. To look closer, to listen harder, to seek out the stories hidden in plain sight. His life asked us to pause and consider the people around us, those whose quiet strength we might miss if we don't take the time to see. His story was a reminder that the most powerful moments don't always come with fanfare or fireworks. Sometimes they arrive in the form of a faded tattoo, a shared meal, or a soldier who says, with a voice soft but sure, "I just came to remember a friend." And in that simplicity lies a truth that can change how we see the world and how we choose to live in it.